Well, hello everyone. Thank you for tuning in wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. 2 years ago, the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, and nearly 2 years ago, US forces completed their withdrawal from Afghanistan. This month, the Wilson Center is producing a series of content to mark these two anniversaries. It is part of an ongoing series launched soon before the US withdrawal called Hindsight Upfront Afghanistan. The Hindsight Upfront initiative aims to help ensure that Afghanistan continues to figure in policy and public debates in Washington and beyond. It will keep you informed about the future of Afghanistan, its people, the region, and why it matters. For more information, please see the Hindsight Upfront Afghanistan website at afghanistan.wilsoncenter.org. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by three prominent and distinguished Afghan thought leaders who will participate in a conversation with me about Taliban-led Afghanistan 2 years on. We will look at what has transpired on policy levels over the last 2 years, and we will also look to the future in terms of what to expect in the next year and what role the international community can reasonably play to help address Afghanistan's many complex challenges. Let me very briefly introduce our three panelists. Dr. Soraya Dalil is a physician. She has also served as a visiting fellow at Harvard. She is a former Afghan Minister of Public Health and a former Afghan ambassador to the UN. We're also delighted to have with us two Wilson Center colleagues. Dr. Mirwais Balki is a Wilson Center Fellow and a scholar of international relations. He is also a specialist on education policy and security. He's a former Afghan Minister of Education and a former Afghan diplomat. Mr. Nader Naderi is a Wilson Center Senior Fellow. He is also an Associate Fellow at the Asser Institute and a visiting fellow at Stanford. He is an expert on and advocate for human rights, justice, and peace building. He previously served as a senior advisor to the president of Afghanistan and was a participant from the government side in the Doha talks with the Taliban in 2020 and 2021. So thank you to the three of you for joining me for this important conversation. And let's get started and get right into it. My first question that I will pose to you all is, how would you assess on policy levels the Taliban's performance over the last 2 years? And Nader, we'll start with you. And I would invite you, if you'd like, to describe the Taliban's brand of basic governance, its capacity for basic service delivery and revenue generation, and its use of justice. And also, how do you think that the Taliban's level of brutality compares to its time in power in the 1990s? Over to you, Nader.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning, Michael and colleagues on this call. It's a sad day to remember 2 years on. Directly to your question, we do have at least two types of governance models globally known. Democratic representative governance, where the people matters most. And then we have authoritarian ones, where certain ideologies or theology or a political agenda through suppression is being enforced on people. It's rule by law, it's not rule of law. Today in Afghanistan, the brand of the Taliban's governance is the latter, an authoritarian system of governance that has limited views of the government's responsibility towards its citizens. The role of citizens is so minimal, and therefore, or even not being considered in the process of decision making. Delivery of services is not considered as the prime obligation of the state or the authority in charge, but obeying the orders and the rule of the authority, basically controlling the life, every aspect of the life of the population, is considered a prime obligation of the citizens. And therefore we have a very repressive system of governance applied with limited scope. While there's no delivery of services on health, on education, the basic services are denied to the population. But population are expected not to raise voices and to not have the right to gather and the right of freedom of assembly and the rest of the Bill of Rights chapters of Afghan constitutions that have had since 1990. Over a century, the Afghans have been practicing most of those rights. All of those are being abolished. Now, toward your question about their repression and a violation of human rights, to compare between the 90s and their second rule, there's little difference, except from the fact that they today allow media to operate with a restricted and limited level. They do love now cameras. They didn't in the past. So that's the only change. However, the systematic application of suppression through state agencies, the GDI, General Director of Intelligence, and the Vice and Virtue institution, is an addition to their ability to enforce their way of life on population. They enforce a lot, extracting revenues from population. There is a lot praises on them to say that they are collecting taxes, which is, on one hand, they have been successful to collect taxes, but on the other hand, the taxes are very excessive, that does not meet the economic well-being of the country and would not allow the society and the economy to grow. But also there are additional taxes, the religious taxes they apply. There's no code that the population would know what kind of taxes they have to pay. Some of the old systems are applied, some of the new one. While Transparency International ranked them that the corruption has gone down, but I urge everybody to look deep down to some of the other indicators. Look at the level of liquidity that has gone down, and with that there's lesser money. Look at the custom departments. There is a lower level of leakages as it was in the past, but there's also a large scale of corruption when you look at the mining sector and the way the mining contracts are done and other contracts are. So it's mostly, unfortunately, a negative trend, a discouraging situation, and it needs a careful thought to be pragmatist, to help the population, but also to look forward for a longer term situation of the miseries that they bring upon the population.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nader. I want to turn to you now, Soraya, as a public health specialist. What do you think have been the most serious public health challenges over the last 2 years in Afghanistan, and how, if at all, have they been addressed? One big public health challenge that we hear so much about is malnutrition. Serious food insecurity. What has been done to address this over the last 2 years? Has this severe problem been eased at all? And also, the Taliban, as I understand it, have backed a WHO polio vaccination campaign soon after they came to power, but they also, of course, have banned women from working with NGOs. So how have the Taliban impacted international public health assistance, and what do you think has been the impact on girls and women? Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I think for Afghanistan, the past 2 years have been dark, not only with regards to the public health and health sector, but overall. Let's admit the fact that healthcare and health sector is part of the overall system in any given country, and it's not in an isolated service or system by itself. So what we have seen in Afghanistan in the last 2 years is remarkably tragic and dark in many fronts, including in the area of public health. Now, until 2 years ago, more than 1/5 of healthcare providers were female. The last 20 years, investment in girls' education, in jobs, and overall development really enhanced girls' education and women's employment in Afghanistan, and in particular in health sector. Health sector is traditionally attractive to women in Afghanistan. It has been attractive for many, many decades. Women in Afghanistan, they have been interested to become physicians or nurses or midwives, or they wanted to become teachers. Although that trend has shifted in the last 2 to 3 decades, they become journalists, they went into other fields for all good reasons, including, and they become in media and journalism and business, in military and security, and the area of law and law enforcement, etc. However, healthcare provision was still an attractive field and discipline for many, many young women in Afghanistan. So what has happened is the impact of the policies in the last 2 years has greatly affected healthcare provision in terms of the supply side, but also in terms of the demand side. In terms of the supply side, we know that many educated people have had to leave the country. And of course, the healthcare professionals are not outside that cohort. So we have a health workforce shortage. We used to have a health workforce shortage, but with the brain drain, that has become severe. We also had COVID-19 pandemic worldwide, and that affected the health workforce in any country, whether it's in North or in West, whether it's in global North or global West. So I know my colleagues, physicians, healthcare providers who have died because of the COVID-19 infection. So that was another burden on health professionals. So, but also the supply, when you cannot provide regular salaries, when you cannot provide continued training, when there's no job prospect, career development opportunities, there's tendency for the healthcare providers and professionals also to be less encouraged and to think of other options and pathways, including migration. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side, there has been systematic discrimination to reduce demand, especially for girls and women. For example, in Ghazni province, local authorities few months ago, they issued a formal letter saying that no woman can come to the clinics or hospital without having a male, a companion, or a relative. That severely restricts women's access to healthcare. The letter also went beyond that, and they say no doctor or no physician in the clinic or hospital is allowed to treat a female who is presenting herself without a male relative. So you see how systematic the discrimination is when this becomes part of the policy of the system itself. Or, for example, in Herat, one of very progressive province, there was an order, a letter in the Herat Provincial Hospital that ultrasound and diagnostic medical sonography is forbidden for women. It's totally forbidden. Now you see that, so the restrictions on both supply and demand side compound the overall access to care, provision of care, and it impacts child mortality, maternal mortality, families' health, communities' well-being, etc., etc. Now, that is on top of the context, which is deteriorating economic situation, that is drought and flood and other natural disasters and overall food insecurity. That is when sometimes borders are closed, and then you have that affects trades of goods and supplies and so on and so forth. So I think the situation in health is quite complex and unfortunately dark and disappointing.
Well, thank you very much for that very sobering appraisal. Thank you. Amirwais, let's come to you, and I don't expect your assessment to be any more optimistic than the others. But let me ask you, and I know that you wear two hats as an educationist and also someone that focuses on security. So two different sets of questions. The first one to you, Amirwais, on this broader issue of assessing the last 2 years. Why do you think the Taliban have imposed girls' education bans, and what else stands out for you about the Taliban's approach to education policy over the last 2 years? And on security, the Taliban claim that they have weakened Islamic State Khorasan, which is really the only militant rival of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Do you agree with that when they say they claim they've weakened this group? And also, how have the Taliban dealt with Al-Qaeda and other Taliban-allied terror groups in Afghanistan? So over to you, Amirwais.
Thank you very much, Michael. Well, before going into the root of why Taliban imposing a ban on girls' education in Afghanistan, I think it's better to define Taliban. Then it would be easy to understand why they are imposing such ban. For me, always I say that the definition or the clear definition of Taliban is that they are an ideological armed radical groups dominantly with tribal background. So for such a group in any parts of the world, not only in Afghanistan, banning or imposing any rights on women serves not only ideological but also as a means. Because if you go to the decrees of the supreme leader of Taliban, if you go to the book written by Haqqani, which is forwarded by the Mullah Hibatullah, it clearly says that there is no any primary concern or primary rules and regulations or obligation of Islam or Sharia to deliver education for girls up to the needs. That is why ideologically it is an end to the Taliban. It's an objective not to allow any education opportunity to the women and girls in Afghanistan. And also as a means, Taliban, they are looking for ground legitimacy among the fighters, among the sympathizers and followers who have fought in the same front with the Taliban against the government of Afghanistan and against the international troops. And one of the legitimizing factor in the past 20 years was that the government of Afghanistan and the international community in Afghanistan, they are coming to Afghanistan to westernize the women of Afghanistan or to demoralize the people of Afghanistan. So since the legitimizing factor has given a legitimacy among few tribal people, especially or with deprived background in Afghanistan, in the rural areas, now they know that if they allow girls' education in Afghanistan, they will lose that legitimacy. And the rival group, in the other radical group, ISK is trying somehow to gain the same legitimacy to their own fighters in Afghanistan. And they are now criticizing Taliban for being westernized, for dealing with the US. And they know that if they remove that imposing ban from girls and women or from education, then these fighters, they will leave the Taliban fronts and they will join the ISK. So, as a means and as an end, both serves the Taliban, and that is why some of the moralistic or some of the news or expectations that I have seen from some Western diplomats that they are saying Taliban are somehow trying to justify in a way that the Afghanistan society is not ready to transform in a way that they or the people they accept girls' education. We have to give time and give space to the Taliban. That is completely a very optimistic expectation from Taliban, and that will not be happen. And not only that, as Nadri was pointing, the Taliban so far in the past 20 years, what they are doing is not any policies or implementation for the development of education or any sector of the society. They have done anything. They have not done anything, except what they are doing is somehow trying to issue decrees so that they can fulfill their dreams, which were not fulfilled in the 90s. That is why on the education sector, we are always witnessing issuing decrees, rules, and regulations to impose more limitations to girls and women in Afghanistan. Suppose recently, though they banned the secondary education, the high school education, the universities for women and girls, but also recently they have also stopped uh, girls who have little bit higher heights. 10 years old girls not to go to school even at a fourth standard, fifth standard, though it was supposed to be until sixth standard. So this way they are somehow trying to even put a ban or impose a ban on fifth, sixth elementary education for girls and for daughters. So that is what we have nowadays on education sector. Especially, I'm little bit concerned that more things I think we have to expect yet from the Taliban because they so far what they have done is kind of imposing a structural ban on education, but for the content also they are somehow trying to bring changes and transformation. For example, on curriculum, except those subjects which were eliminated from the curriculum system of Afghanistan education. Nowadays, they have tried a pilot project of illiteracy program to ideologize or to somehow incorporate their own thoughts and lessons into books and lessons. And nowadays, they are trying to work on curriculum reform to bring certain ideologic lessons and thoughts into school curriculum as well. The teachers also the new recruitment are from madrasa background. Suppose how would be the education system when a madrasa background teacher will teach chemistry, will teach physics, will teach biology at the school level. At the same time, some of the the modern schools are turned as madrasa in different provinces, especially the girls' schools in different provinces since they are closed. So they transformed or they changed to madrasa system in the country. So these are the overall scenarios that we have on education nowadays from the Taliban side. And in the past 2 years, again, the excuse and justification they are somehow giving that they are trying somehow to pave spaces and opportunity so that the girls they can go to school in the near future. They have not done even a single program or step so that we have to expect that yes, there are some optimism and some hopes. regarding the security, again, Michael, I believe that we have to always differentiate between the subjective claims and the objective ground realities in Afghanistan. They claim that the ISK is weakened in Afghanistan, but the ground reality shows the reverse. The insecurity situations that we had at the end of the former government in Afghanistan, as our officials were not secure, go to the outskirts of the cities or going to the remote areas or rural areas in Afghanistan. The same situation now the Taliban themselves are facing. And bomb blast, suicide bombing, launching rockets, assassinations, kidnaps, all these things are happening in all across the country. What is the parameters or what are the index of weakening an organization or a rival organization in a country? Just a few months back, the governor of Balkh was killed in his own office in Afghanistan. That in Darzab town in northern Afghanistan, in Jawzjan, in Badakhshan, in Kapisa, in Jalalabad, in many provinces, the commanders and the soldiers, the fighters of ISK are active, and they are assassinating the Taliban's, official people or bureaucrat people. So that is why I think it is just a claim, and it would be too difficult to accept based on that ground realities. What will do Taliban to ISK or to Al Qaeda or other groups? I believe that when there is a symbiotic living between Al Qaeda and Taliban, or Taliban with other international terrorist groups, it would be difficult to expect from a radical armed groups to disconnect themselves from Al Qaeda. And Al Qaeda gives the sources of income to the Taliban even now, and other international groups. You see that TTP, even the Taliban, they themselves say that we are trying somehow to displace them for example, from southern Afghanistan to northern Afghanistan. And certain other groups from Uzbekistan, from Tajikistan, from China, they are frankly walking on the streets in different provinces, and the people of Afghanistan, they are witnessing that and they are seeing that. So you can see that it's a hub for all these international terrorist groups. So above all, Michael, to whose expectation the Taliban, they disconnect themselves from Al Qaeda? The U.S., they are fighting against U.S. To any other international organization or countries, no, because they know that disconnecting themselves from Al Qaeda or any international groups would not suit the ideology, the objectives that the Taliban, or it defines the philosophy of the existence of the Taliban. So that is why I believe that as the ISIS was the discontented members of Al Qaeda in Levant, the same way ISK is the discontented Taliban members in Afghanistan, and they know the tactics and they know the means and approach how to fight the Taliban. So I think these are all claims, and the ISK, not only ISK, other military groups are also expanding in Afghanistan to delegitimize the Taliban and also to gain power in the country.
Thank you very much for that, Mirwais. Really interesting, comprehensive responses. Thank you. I know that Nader wanted to briefly weigh in. So Nader, please go ahead, and then we'll move into thinking about the future. Go ahead, Nader.
Well, thank you. Just to add probably a couple of points to what Mr. Balkhi talked both on education and on the security. And the education one additional element is that the Taliban's restriction on education is part of a systematic oppression behavior. So they try to put in place sets of rules and systems to further oppress and deny the majority of the population, but specifically the women of Afghanistan, of all their rights to education, to health, to social life. They are talking about some economic activity, but even with the rest of environment that they have, the ecosystem they have created, the environment they have created, it will be difficult for women to even operate in the areas that they consider that the woman could operate, as an example on economic activity. And they do it basically to dominate completely over the life of a segment of the society, and therefore treat them with inhuman acts. And all of these three acts are elements of a crime of apartheid, and therefore Afghan women are rightly calling for recognition of gender apartheid under international law. And I think it's time for the rest of the international community and their morale to be shaken as it was during the 80s and 70s with the South Africa to join these voices of Afghan women. It is not that the Afghan society doesn't want education or the Afghan religious community. There are numerous fatwas from the mullahs, the community itself. A majority of the Afghan population are demanding access to education, provision of education facilities for the girls, but it is purely for that political reason and not religious reasons that justified and folded into the religious cover that the Taliban are adding to their level of suppression. On the Daesh question, it's always very important to look at the regional dynamic the Taliban coming into power have created. So while there is apparently into the surface, there is an overlap and convergence of interest of the United States and the Taliban in fighting with Daesh. For the Taliban, it is a group that's fighting against their authority, and therefore it is their own domestic power interest that drives them to fight, not broader global obligation as the US calls that it's under Doha agreement that they have to fight. For the US, of course, that is fighting with one group that is looks more militant. But we shall not forget that in the past 20 years and today and in the future, it has been a group like Taliban that created an environment where other terrorist groups could flourish. And there are a number of studies and assessments of intelligence communities. There are over 20 different groups of terrorist lineages and terrorist interests operating in Afghanistan. Look at what kind of a dynamic it created in the region. The Pakistan situation, the TTP, it's their own doing. They're getting their own dose of what they've created, a Frankenstein monster against Afghanistan, but it's hurting the civilian population and the stability of Pakistan state. The rest of the region, Iran is nervous, Central Asia is nervous, Russia is nervous, while they also try to keep a level of relation or at least some discussion with the Taliban. So the threat of terrorism regionally is not being diminished, but added to it. China is concerned, as the Taliban suggested to Chinese early on that they shall engage in negotiating with the Islamic, the ATMI, the ETIM, the group, East Turkestan Islamic Movement. But they did the same thing they suggested to Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan went ahead. So the threat to the region potentially exists and continue to be strengthened, but also internationally taking the bigger problem of this migration route, and with that, a lot of elements of these groups could find their ways into other places, will remain an international security concern.
Well, thank you very much for that, Nader. So, what I like to do now is take the conversation a bit to a more forward-looking approach. We've heard some, predictably troubling assessments of the last 2 years in Afghanistan, but I think that a big question to consider is, what's next? And in a moment, I will want to ask you all to weigh in on what role you think the international community should play in trying to help Afghanistan address its challenges. But first, before we get to that, I think it's important just to take stock of what might be coming up around the corner. So I think if we could envision, if I could ask each of you to envision the policy climate in your area of focus, how it might be evolving or playing out in the next year or so, and particularly because it's obviously difficult to predict, what do you think might be some helpful signposts to keep in mind in considering what the next year may look like on a policy level in your areas of focus? So Dr. Dalil, Soraya, come back to you on this first. What do you expect to see in the public health sector over the next year?
Not a lot of positive signposts can be visible at this stage. The elements, the ingredients that could direct us to see a more negative picture, an image is more powerful than those who could draw a positive picture. And what will happen in Afghanistan will also depend on the region itself, what's going on in the region, including in Central Asia, in Pakistan, in Iran, as well as in China, and the relationship and the interaction between those multiple countries, as well as the US itself. I think what is important for Afghans, and especially for the political community, like those the distinguished panelists here, is that we really need to have some critical questions and discussions among us and go into the root causes. We cannot be subject to foreign policies of other states as such and be maneuvered by decisions that are made in other territories and affect the life of every Afghan, no matter where they live in Afghanistan. I think the level of vulnerability for millions of Afghans have increased tremendously. That justifies an honest, truthful debate and discussion among ourselves with a think of self-reliance and self-dependency. I think being dependent on even foreign aid, foreign assistance, foreign-based solutions is not going to take us very far. We have seen that. We paid a huge price for that. It's not only I paid it or distinguished colleagues of me who were around the cabinet ministry table in the palace who paid it. It's also ordinary farmer, ordinary civil worker, ordinary women and men in Afghanistan who paid this price. We have to be honest. We have to speak very courageously and with really brutal truth, and to see what went wrong and how this can be prevented in future. And I think to the US audience, I would say that you need to distinguish really between your foreign policy and military interest versus human rights principles. I think in Afghanistan, to my reading, the foreign policy and military interest was prioritized over human rights principles. And I think that is what we see the consequences. We spoke in the last half an hour that why Taliban are oppressive towards women and so on. But we know why they are like that. But the question is what needs to be done in future. And the answer is we need to listen to women and men in Afghanistan. We need to engage with them. They're really, really smart, and they're so clear. This move that says non-kar azadi or bread, work, and freedom. I think this narrative and this storyline has never been this clear in the decades in Afghanistan for any women/civil movement in Afghanistan. And that has to be supported. That has to be genuinely supported, because that's coming from a very, very grassroots level, and it's coming continuously at various scale, in various formats, and that has to be supported, and that has to be acknowledged and empowered. And that would be my message.
Thank you very much for that, Soraya. Nader, let's bring you into this, and from a governance perspective or a governance rights perspective. As you know, one of the consistent demands of the international community is that the Taliban should become more inclusive and feature more women and religious minorities and so on in their regime. Do you think there's any chance of that happening over the next year?
Well, Michael, when we look at some of the indicators of any change or continuation and consistency, unfortunately, when I look and talk with people, not only in Kabul, but in Kandahar and other provinces, I do not see internal deliberation among the policy-making circles of the Taliban leadership that would give me a hope that there will be a change of course, at least to a minimum level, taking on the issues of women's rights and especially in their education and other rights, but also in general in terms of political inclusivity. I have negotiated with Taliban for almost a year. I know them from past engagements also, and then left under them and in their present, in their first rule. From what I know in interaction with them, their definition of a government is very much different from the ordinary Afghans' expectation, from what Afghans have seen throughout ups and downs in the past 4 decades in that sense. And therefore, they only trust. There is a significant lack of trust in the society and in the rest of the population among those internal groups of the Taliban. And therefore, that absence of trust to others make them to only stay within themselves. They even do not can have confidence or trust to some of their own members that were with them in the first rule that they have had in the 90s. And that's a clear indicator that they would continue. There's no policy deliberation of change. Second issue is absence of an interest to set up clarity by systems of laws, and therefore to begin with the Constitution, the foundation of any governance and any countries and states operation is that contract, whatever way it's imposed, full of authority to the ruling and full of obligation to the population. Even that, there need to be a document, a constitution. There's no intent or internal discussion that you would hear about that they are going towards setting up a process for a constitutional development or approval. The same goes with their overall structure of acting or temporary government. Some indicate that to the attitude of some of the Taliban members, that they believe the way they are operating is not sustaining the country and they cannot sustain their power over population, and therefore it's temporary. they have not even moved to the country like some in the past with their family, and they may be there for a short term, and therefore they don't think of a permanent state institution. It's a good thing, but also a bad thing. So in my view, looking to all the indicators on ground and their internal policies, they would continue the same as they did in the past 2 years. There won't be any process for constitutional development. The suppression of rights will continue. So far, 86 decrees and rulings to suppress rights of not only women, but the rest of the society. Political activities will further be curtailed. They have issued a decree that political actors cannot engage in political activities. They can live as citizens without any rights or freedom to engage in political activities or social activities. That will go further, I believe, while the decree is issued, but not entirely implemented in different corners of the country. But it's going to, because of this new department they created, the Department of Monitoring and Oversight of the Amir's decrees, is going to enforce most of those decrees. Therefore, further curtailment of the political freedoms and activity. But at the same time, the international community's dilemma, I believe, would continue. Economy, I see, started to show some signs of decline because the aid is declining. Most of the donors are not able to justify to their own parliaments continuation of a significant amount of aid to Afghanistan. For example, Germany significantly reduced its contribution to aid, so that a number of other countries are considering to do the same. Once the liquidity through the aid coming to the country goes down, the economy will further shrink and further get hit. And therefore that stability that some people predict, or the World Bank's last year or the past 6 months says that there is stability on currency, is going to be affected in the next year, unfortunately. Donors to mitigate that, of course, as the last visit of the US delegation and meeting with the Taliban's foreign, so-called foreign minister, and the language used there suggests that there are some attempts to look at the stabilization of economy, but also to highlight that, to give incentives to the Taliban, to highlight some of the so-called progress that they had, taking from the narcotics cultivation drop to the security expansion, which is undue or unnecessary credit that they're giving to the Taliban, because it was the Taliban creating that environment of insecurity, blowing up everywhere from school to mosque to streets. Now they are in charge, so they're not blowing up, and therefore giving them credit for security is not required. But anyway, those process of finding ways to engage will continue at the same time through the coming year.
Well, thanks, Nader. So, Mirwais, let's come to you. I mean, we've heard Nader and Soraya provide proposed or suggested trajectories for Afghanistan over the next year, which do not appear to be very bright for the reasons that they laid out. Now, let's come to you on the issue of education. I can't help but ask you, do you think there's any chance that girls' schools could reopen? And if so, under what circumstances could this come about? And on the security front, coming back to the terrorism discussion that you and Nader were having before, do you expect, or there's any chance that the Taliban could decide to move against any terror groups in the country other than ISK? And if so, under what circumstances? So over to you, Mirwais.
Well, on education, the years ahead of us do not look good in Afghanistan, because what we are facing nowadays in Afghanistan is a gradual collapse of educational infrastructure. Even then, when we were in the Ministry of Education and when we were investing on education in Afghanistan, we were concerned about certain obstacles, certain limitations in Afghanistan, and we could not meet the expectations of the people in different, even urban areas in Afghanistan, the demand for education, which were then and now also the same situation we have. In addition to that, we are putting more obstacles into that. So that is why uh, I have concern about bad education in Afghanistan. There is a statement always we hear that sometimes no education is better than bad education. So what we are seeing in Afghanistan, not only for girls but also for boys, the imposing curriculum, the verbal content and curriculum, the hidden curriculums that they are being taught in different schools, and if the new teachers are being recruited from different madrasas, of course, the madrasas are also categorized in Taliban ideology. So, what will be delivered to the young generation in Afghanistan is completely a segregated content which talks about a narrowed ideology, how to deal with self and others. So that is why I believe that if you do not have even the minimum infrastructure in Afghanistan on education, then the scenario will be worst. And even if the international community gradually deliver some of the opportunities, finance or assistance to the education, without infrastructure, how you can implement that? That's the biggest concern that I have. In addition to that, nowadays the existing teachers in Afghanistan, they are leaving the schools, they are leaving the Ministry of Education for different other jobs because they have to earn at the end of the day. The overall poverty situation and ratio, which is growing up, unfortunately, nowadays, also affects the education infrastructure and also the education opportunity in the country, because majority of the families, they prefer to send their children to the jobs on the street and different other areas than to sending to the schools. Those who can afford to leave Afghanistan nowadays, millions of people, they migrated to Pakistan, migrated to Iran for their daughters' education, for their boys' education. I speak with many families in Afghanistan, and they say that yes, there is a catastrophe that the girls they cannot go to school. But what about boys? Because they are also at the same time concerned about their boys. So that is the scenarios ahead that we are expecting in the years ahead in the country. On security, that's an important question, whether the Taliban they fight all these other organizations or not. What I believe is that any uh, other radical organization which threatens the existence of Taliban, of course, Taliban will fight for their own survival in Afghanistan. But the question is whether they can afford to fight or not is little bit, I think, needs detail, because those who are the offshoots of the Taliban, those who are the discontented groups of the Taliban, those who are using the same means to fight against Taliban, I think they are more energetic, they are more, I mean, pro-war in Afghanistan because they have the rural areas under their control and different movements in across the country, and they are recruiting young generation from other madrasas and from other places, because the Taliban now, as an administration, as a regime, cannot give the expectations of the thousands and thousands armed fighters who were somehow trying to plunder and somehow trying to earn money through illegal ways in the past 20 years. And now most of them, they do not have the source of income in Afghanistan. So they are trying to see some other sources of income, especially in rural areas. They are joining ISK and other groups because they give salary, they give somehow illegal spaces to earn money. So that is why the security scenario ahead of us is, again, I believe that the continuous battleground will remain in Afghanistan, and the conventional fighting, the conventional war that the Taliban are nowadays conducting somehow does not help to fight against these organizations. As in the past 20 years, also the conventional war by the international troops and by the government of Afghanistan could not eliminate the Taliban. It cannot eliminate the ISK also in Afghanistan and any other groups who are now against the Taliban. There is another reality also, and that is the Taliban's nature itself is very much vulnerable. We somehow in the beginning were expecting that there is a single hierarchy organization which will rule Afghanistan through totalitarian ways. But nowadays we know that there are multi vices, there are contradictions, there are groupings, there are different interpretations and narratives inside Taliban itself. The ethnic divisions they have, the geographical divisions that they have, the ideological divisions that they have. So all these divisions that they have inside themselves, I believe, will also a means of distractions for the Taliban to make themselves focus on their own survival inside Afghanistan. So both on education and security, we do not have any positive signposts or any optimism and hope so that get things a little bit better on these sectors.
So thanks for that, Mirwais. I want us to stay for just a few more minutes on this issue of the role of the international community, especially because we've heard from all of you that things have not been good over the last 2 years, as we know, and that things are likely not going to get any better. But what space might there be, if any, for the key international actors, particularly the U.S., to try to at the very least, help improve the plight of the Afghan people on humanitarian grounds? And I think there's been a question that many of us analysts on the outside have been asking ourselves, and that is essentially, is there any way to go beyond what's already coming, humanitarian aid? Is there any way to go beyond that, to bring more relief to the Afghan people, but without violating the sanctions regime on the Taliban? So I would welcome if any of you would like to weigh in on how you would go about that conundrum. Is there some type of middle ground, going further than humanitarian aid, but without getting yourself in a position where you risk violating the sanctions regime? And related to that is, I think, another key question. Do you think that the international community, and again, I would emphasize the US, but generally speaking, do you think the international community should engage more, less, or the same with the Taliban? As you know, no country has recognized the Taliban, but many countries, including the US, many governments engage with the Taliban. As someone mentioned, there was just a meeting of some senior US officials had met with Taliban leaders not too long ago. So I throw this back. I know these are tough questions to ask, but I throw this back to any of you, if any of you would like to reply to those questions.
I think my mic is on, so let me talk.
Please.
Uh, uh, See, Michael, the US or international community cannot disengage from Afghanistan because Afghanistan is a reality, and the people of Afghanistan, 40 million of people there in Afghanistan, is a reality in a part of the world. And if they are in catastrophe in danger, of course, it affects everywhere else. But I would suggest a kind of defined engagement with Afghanistan, a unified, persistent engagement with the people of Afghanistan. First of all, we do not have a unified or a defined or a single message from the international community to the Taliban and to the people of Afghanistan. For example, when there are senior diplomatic meetings of the US or, for example, Norway or Sweden or anyone with the Taliban, uh, they deliver different messages and they receive different messages. And the Taliban, when the international media they say the Taliban are changed, I also say changed because they know how to play diplomatic and they know how to use different new tools to some kind of convince the opposite and to long survive. That is why that's one important major issue that if there is no a clear message, unified and defined message, I think the Taliban they know there are some vacuums, there are some spaces to play and to go on. And the second thing, which is very important, is that uh, there has to be a difference between the humanitarian and financial assistance. The humanitarian needs that is amassed because the people of Afghanistan is nowadays in a disaster situation and the poverty ratio is just reached its climax. So that is what for the financial assistance there has to be an oversight from the ground realities through international NGOs and through different other mechanisms. I always propose that if on different sectors of education, health, or other humanitarian aids, there has to be consortiums of different donors so that at least through international NGOs or leading by international NGOs and implementing through CDCs in Afghanistan, that is workable in Afghanistan. So that the people they directly receive the donations and they distribute based on justice and in a clear method. For example, on education, there are countries who are friends of Afghanistan on education, who are supporters of education on Afghanistan. They can make a consortium of education sector and work through, for example, Save the Children from Agha, or for example, through Agha Khan Foundation. Then the CDCs, they are pressure groups inside Afghanistan, and Taliban are also some of them. They are parts of these district councils. So these can be applicable and working, and there would be a very oversighted process so that the engagement can be within a limitation. And we are also at the same time assured that the assistance and aids are not going into the channel of Taliban to misuse for their own survival.
Interesting. Very useful. Thanks for that, Mirwais. Nader, please go ahead. I know you wanted to respond.
Thank you. Just to add a few points. When we expect from international community, this expectation need to be formulated within this new global reality, from Ukraine war to the global power competition with China, and then the increasing instability in Africa and in Central Africa, including what's happening in Niger, in Senegal, and Sudan, and you name it, the increasing global crisis, which all of them demand global attention and humanitarian aid. Within that context, the focus on Afghanistan, unfortunately, has, especially with the disengagement of a large number of international communities, actors in Afghanistan, and the consequences of the 2 years ago, the 15th August collapse and the withdrawal, have forced policymakers to narrow down because of their own domestic political needs. Some embarrassed by those policies don't want to bring back to the surface of debate. Some feel guilty, and some doesn't have the amount of resources to focus on Afghanistan. So their focus has become so narrow, and therefore the leverages of international actors, including the United States, is so narrow, and especially because the policy is a very focused, narrow policy these days, if it's defined to looking to some of the measures and being taken, or some of the talking points that are being said by the administration. So all of that gives us limited possibility to see how the international community would influence realities on ground to change, and the Taliban to change. We've lived long with the Taliban to understand that what could help their attitude change and what would not. Certainly, the current on-off and as approach, and as Mr. Belkhi said, inconsistent messaging is not going to work with them. They sustained their positions for a long period of time. They learned and now believe that they don't need to change. The international community has to change their attitude. Within that context, briefly, it's much more complex, but briefly simplifying that, what is required for the US to continue keeping this international informal consensus of keeping this leverage of not recognizing the government of Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, because they don't have yet domestic legitimacy, they don't have the buy-in of the Afghan population, and therefore it is justifiable and logical for international community to endorse the demands of Afghan population, which they say, unless they change, they make inclusive, they make an acceptable government, they wouldn't gain domestic legitimacy, and therefore you shouldn't be giving them international legitimacy. So keep that and continue preserving it. Tom Wist is doing a good job going around and meeting with people. It's important to keep the regional consensus on that. So far, it's been preserved. It needs to be preserved further and strengthened. Second, empower the Afghan voices. My message to my Afghan counterparts are that do not wait for the US or any other international actors, as Minister Dalili said. It's our country. We have to do things that changes the situation and the life of our own people. We owe it to the 40 million population who are being left to the misery today because of some of our wrong policies and decisions when we were in the government have taken. So we have to take some burden and not rely everything to international actors. We have to take the lead. And the first thing is to create a unifying voice. The international community, the US, can facilitate part of that unification of the voices. There are 5 top issues that all Afghans agree: diaspora and insight. And for the US and international community, when they meet with the Taliban de facto authorities, make sure that this message is sent also that there are other actors in Afghan society, like it was in the late 90s when the Taliban and other fighting factions were in Afghanistan. The former UN Special Envoy, Francis Vendrell, the late Francis Vendrell, have decided to look for non-violent democratic forces out of the warlord circles to also engage with them. It must be a much more broader consultation with a wider spectrum of Afghan society, so the Taliban can see that they are not the only group in the country, but there are other actors too. And lastly, it is this preservation of the civic space. This situation may continue for a decade or longer or lesser, hopefully lesser. But to enable the Afghan society, the international community, through different means, political, moral support, or sometimes financial, they need to engage in a way that do not harm but strengthen those social activists on ground to expand the civic space. People like we saw is education leader, education activist leader, civil society leader, is in prison now for 4 months. And I don't see a collective outrage from international actors. As Minister Belhi said, it's on one issue, it's engagement. You do engage on saving life, on humanitarian issues, technical issues that need to be separated from political issues. And those political issues need to be principle-based. I think expecting the Taliban to only by a meeting they would change, they wouldn't. You need to be consistent, and in every meeting be public on what you hold them accountable, and that need to be very much clearly stated to their face too, that you're worried about their treatment of the population, and you're endorsing the voices of Afghans instead of saying this is my demand.
Thank you very much for that, Nader. Soraya, did you want to weigh in before
Yes.
Yeah,
yes,
please.
indeed. I would like to say that engagement with Afghanistan is inevitable. So we have seen that before in the past years, for good reasons or not for good reasons, Afghanistan will remain on the table. Engagement with the Taliban should be principle-based engagement. It's easy to say and it's very tough to do that, but I think this is the message I would like to convey, that your engagement with the Taliban should be genuinely based on principles, and that means based on human rights, on dignity, on justice, and on accountability. Make them accountable. We need to find that coherent voice and messages to them that you are accountable for whatever is going on in Afghanistan, and they should be held accountable for that. When we say Afghanistan, engagement with Afghanistan is key, it doesn't mean only Taliban. It also means civil society. It means women's movement groups inside the country. It means various voices inside and outside the country. So also engagement with them is key to this one. So yeah, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. We are running out of time, but I wanted to end by posing one final question to you all, and I would invite your brief responses if you'd like. And this, I'd like to conclude on a reflective, retrospective note. You all served in the Afghan government on very senior levels in the years prior to the Taliban takeover. Different times and in different posts, but you all served. Two of you were cabinet ministers at one point. Sarai was a health minister. Mirwais was a education minister. Nader, of course, had been a senior advisor to President Ghani and was very involved in the Doha talks with the Taliban. So I would be curious to ask you all, in retrospect, is there anything that you would have done differently in your capacities as senior policymakers, given how things have ended up in Afghanistan today? And Nader, I think I heard you briefly refer to some mistakes that were made, but I think it would be useful for us to end on this note. Just if any of you would like to weigh in and speak to anything you wish had been done differently when you all were in government in the past prior to the Taliban takeover.
Well, I may start with three probably reflections. First, on the question of justice and accountability. When I was a human rights commissioner, we did a lot collectively, my colleagues and I, to promote not only fundamentals of human rights, but also justice and accountability. When I reflect now, especially the first 5 years after the bomb, especially I joined the Human Rights Commission in 2004. Between 2004 to 2009, while we did a lot to advocate for justice, and I think when I reflect now, we should have been much more aggressive, because that was an area that frustrated people, to see some of those bad actors who been involved in atrocities and being rulers at the different level, at the district level or in other areas. And the same goes to what happened in the villages in Kandahar, in Uruzgan, and other places where some of these bad commanders and former warlords have tried to abuse their relation with the international actors and try to harass communities and then pushing them to the arms of the Taliban. So more demand on accountability and justice and more mobilization is something that I regret that we should have done more. Second comes to the issue of institution building. We begin very late in looking how effective public administrations could bring population back to the side of the constitution and establish that kind of relation between the citizen, bring the citizen closer to the government. There was some efforts, especially in my last year, as I was the chairman of Civil Service Commission. We did a lot to do some work there, but early on that work needed to be happening. It was missed by President Karzai, and then it was missed to look non-politically also by, especially throughout a few years, by President Ghani. So that's a regret that more advocacies needed to be carried out there to strengthen institutions, to make sure that they can sustain and stand aftermath of these kind of storms as the Taliban's revolutionary approach came in. So we have seen most of those gains were rolled back. That strength needed to be built further. The last one is on the peace. When I reflect, I wish we were doing more to expose the Taliban's lack of interest for a shared future. Throughout the peace talks, in the first 3 months, we almost there was a clear understanding. I, for myself, have had a very clear understanding that the Taliban are not interested to peace, and they do not think of a shared future for Afghans, and they want to take everything by force. Exposing that required the different levels of engagement from our political elites in Kabul, explaining of the risks to the president taking a different approach, to US partners, especially Ambassador Zal, who did not engage in looking beyond that limited scope of making the Doha deal to reach somewhere, but to the risks also. We needed to do more to expose Taliban's inability and unwillingness to make peace work, and they were exploiting everything, including they played well to exploit the US's interests in extracting itself from Afghanistan, and we failed to expose that aspects of the Taliban.
Thank you, Nader, for sharing those thoughts and your candor. Anyone else like to weigh in? Yes,
I want to comment. 2 points. I think one of the regrets that I have is that I wish we would have had a better republic system, a better, stronger and effective republic. And by that I mean, I wish we had built effective institutions including democratic institutions like election commission and others. Because if we had a robust, effective, 2 decades old Republican system, that would have delivered on its promises. The institutions, the Republican democracy would have delivered its promise. I looked at the elections that took place, and I really regret the management of the election processes and how irresponsible that went. I was not in charge of that, but as a ministerial cabinet member, I would have raised serious concerns and voiced during that time. This is one. And the second, not a personal regret, but more of a pain, is that I wish the mass of intellectuals, Afghans, would not have left the country 2 years ago, including myself. I think the biggest vacuum that has been created is the loss of educated people, men and women, young and old, inside government, outside government, who left the country in many walks of life, in many disciplines, in many different areas of work. And I wish that would not have happened, and we would have remained, a mass of us inside the country, to confront this from within. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Soraya. Mirwais, did you want to offer a final word before we conclude?
Yes, Michael, I'll emphasize and reiterate what Minister Dalil said for not leaving Afghanistan. I also believe that, yes, if I was with this mentality, then I was not leaving. And I think that was the biggest mistake we all did in Afghanistan. And few, of course, regrets are always with me when I'm thinking on education, on security and nation building in Afghanistan. The first one is that I left Ministry of Education while the design and the reform for the decade of education was completely incomplete. And so if I was little bit emphasizing or working with that program so that we could at least gain some practicable aspect of that reform that we started in the Ministry of Education. And the second thing is that on security, Michael, we always deal tactically, not strategically. And that is the biggest mistake on our approach towards security in Afghanistan. That is why we were gradually failing on the ground. And thirdly, on nation building, the approach that we adopted in Afghanistan, I have also reflected on my book, U.S. nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq as a comparison, that we, from Bonn onward, we focused on a top-down nation building process, which did not work in Afghanistan. So we have many other good modalities and applicable modalities in Afghanistan, which we do not have time to go in details, but we could have a different modalities for nation building in Afghanistan. That's what I'm always concerned. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. I know this is not an easy conversation to have, especially in terms of what we've been discussing the last few minutes, reflecting on what you might have wished been done better. But on the whole, this has been a terrific discussion as we assess the last 2 years of Taliban-led Afghanistan, and then got into some very substantive discussions about what could come next and what role the international community could play specifically. So I wanted to thank you all, Dr. Mirwais Balki, Dr. Soraya Dalil, and Mr. Nadari for joining me. Again, please check out our Hindsight Upfront Afghanistan website at afghanistan.wilsoncenter.org. Our goal is to ensure that Afghanistan continues to feature in public and policy debates in Washington and beyond. I think it's so critical because, as we've heard, there's so much happening that we all need to talk about. So again, thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for joining in. Please keep track of that website that I mentioned to look at additional content coming from the Wilson Center to mark the anniversaries of the withdrawal and of the Taliban takeover. And again, thank you all very much. We will now adjourn.